Storytime with Big Clive. This is new, and for those of you who have never seen me before, all you've heard is my voice, and you've got this image in your head of what I look like. This is what I actually look like, and I'm very sorry if it's a disappointment. It's just how it is. So this video is the first in a few that I'm going to make, just sort of face videos with a sort of backdrop of, this is the what you might call Studio 2. It's where I record stuff, bigger stuff like, hold on, I'm just going to get bigger stuff like streetlights. And I don't make too many videos through here yet because I've not quite got the lighting. I've been experimenting with lighting, but it's not quite perfect yet, so I've not made too many videos through here. However, I've got my dark and stormy, and I'm ready to talk. So let's talk about my favourite job ever, the one I did for over 20 years, and how it all went horribly wrong at the end, which always adds a nice element of spice to such things. So it starts off when I'm a kid, and my mum, knowing I like lights, takes me to George Square in Glasgow to see the Christmas lights. And back then it was done by the council. Glasgow had a really complex history of the Christmas lighting. It used to be common to have Christmas spectaculars. Like in London they had them, Edinburgh they had them, Glasgow they had them, and to go and see the Christmas lights, you'd follow a sort of route which would go down various roads and round the square and up other roads, and they'd all be covered in Christmas lights. It used to be a really major thing, and with the budget cuts of councils these days, it's all kind of just, it's all gone a bit sort of like dull, but not to worry. So back then, the Sauchiehall Street, Buchanan Street, Argyle Street, they all have loads of Christmas lights, and George Square is the epicentre of this activity. And they have a lot of ex-Blackpool Christmas lights. Now, Blackpool is a holiday resort in the UK. It's a seaside resort, but their main thing is the Blackpool illuminations. If you look that up online, you'll find it, and it's spectacular. I've been in their workshops, very, very impressive. And the Blackpool illuminations have a continuous throughput. They've got a huge illuminated sort of parade. It's one of those. It's a drive-through parade again, really. You can either walk or you can actually drive down Blackpool sort of promenade, if you will, and it's just the lights are just all around you, and it's very good. But because they had a continuous flow through of the lights, the councils around Britain used to buy them off them, and Glasgow did that too. So they brought these huge big murals of animated displays, and they look great. I can remember in particular this huge three-dimensional Santa, and you could walk around this Santa. It was just massive thing that, it's when you could actually put Christmas lights at ground level and not have them vandalised. I do see stuff being put at ground level again these days. I guess maybe they're just allowing for vandalism. We used to experience vandalism a lot. It's just what happens when you have lawyers running the country for personal financial gain, is they kind of they just basically sanction vandalism. That's a little anti-lawyer rant there. But anyway, it was all at ground level, including in the sort of lawns. They'd have the huge big fiberglass murals with the sort of sections. There's a characteristic. What do they call them? Is it dioramas they call them? The Blackpool ones, where it's a light box. They've got lamps, but sections cut round it, like a sort of cookie cutter frame round it. And they light up in sections. It means that you get a very detailed sort of image builds up, and they told various sort of stories as such with pictures. And they had these in George Square, but they also had this big Santa, and the Santa that just sticks in the mind, because it made this rhythmic clickety 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 noise, and it was a cam switch inside that was controlling the lights because there was a lot of sort of flashing lights. And likewise, the council guys, who obviously just loved putting the Christmas lights up. The square had festoon coming out from the central sort of monument, going to the sort of corners of the square, and it would all be animated as well. It was just very memorable. So fast forward in time a bit, and someone in Japan invents rope light. Now I have to say, I have to differentiate here, because rope light used to mean something completely different. Nowadays it means stuff like this. The LED or tungsten sort of hard plastic core. But in the past, it used to be a disco material, and it was based on strings of the small push-in Christmas lights, but just the bare lamps, and they'd solder them into long wiring looms and then pull them down the inside of hoses. I just want to differentiate here that that's what rope light used to be. And they used to plug end to end, and they had a bulging connector on the end that plugged into pulsar or mode light controllers, and it made the lights chase alongside the hose. And you think, oh, that's a bit twee, but back at the time it was what we had, and it was really quite impressive. It looked great. But anyway, this guy in Japan invents a new material, and he calls it non-neon. This is a bit of original non-neon. This stuff was cripplingly expensive. This was considered an architectural material. Keep in mind that it is the very, very first rope light. We just take it for granted these days, but back then it was quite special. And he patents it in 1986 and then starts manufacturing it. And not long after that, literally as he's manufacturing it, and it becomes available as an architectural material with really high cost and inflated, it's going to last forever, it's going to use very little power and super rugged. Wasn't. So Harry Tegan gets involved. Glasgow Council employs an architect called Harry Tegan, and the best bit about Harry Tegan is he's got such a character. He's still alive, getting on a bit now, but Harry is super eccentric, and that's what makes this story so special, because you guys literally have a lot to answer, to thank Harry for, because he saw this material and he thought that could be just the thing for Christmas lighting. And because he'd been tasked with the redevelopment of George Square, he shuffled stuff about on it, but he also had these big poles put up along all sides of George Square in Glasgow. And he pulled in a group of blacksmiths, artists, metal fabricators, welders, male and female, because Glasgow has this rich tapestry of engineering. We just have a lot of welders and mechanical people, just because of that era. There was still quite a lot of industry. And they designed these Christmas lights. And because there was nothing to copy, because they were the first ever rope light Christmas lights in history, they were effectively the prototypes of the whole modern Christmas lighting industry. They were heavy. They were made of steel and they weighed a ton. Nowadays it's made of aluminium. It just makes sense. It's easier to manufacture. It's lighter. But back then they were made of steel. And also because there was nothing to copy. These days it would just be flat panels, as they are in George Square. But Harry's vision was much greater than that. He wanted three-dimensional. If you can imagine the old 3D wireframe computer graphics, that's what he saw in these Christmas lights. And at the same time, he also was experimenting. The artists also made these huge steel angels that went on top of the poles, really big, about 10 foot, 12 foot tall. I'm not really sure. Maybe taller. I think some still exist in kind of yards somewhere, but most of that lighting has now been scrapped because of what happens at the end of this story. So Harry is pushing ahead with these just ridiculously over-the-top Christmas lights, and it wasn't a small display. He had this big vision in his head of something that ended up like Gotham City. It was like weird Christmas lights. And if you go and look at George Square now, you'll see the poles are still there. They've got the upper catenary wires on them. But if you look down the poles below them, you'll see there's other eyelets mounted on the side of the poles, and they also had catenary wires, because it was actually two layers that went round the square, then the angels on top, and then there was loads of stuff on the lampposts on the actual square itself. It was just tons of stuff. We're talking hundreds of amps a phase all round the square. It was a big power supply required for it. This also included the hanging effects, which initially were sort of flat metal frames, but they were covered in festoon. And the festoon, it would have been great if they'd just put ordinary lamps in it, because it was the standard 240 volt Edison screw and bayonet cap festoon with a little rubber sealing ring that when you put a lamp into it, do I have a lamp here? I've got a lamp here. When you put the lamp into it, it seals onto the rubber when it goes in. It actually cups round it and it stops it letting water in. But at the time, they chose architectural lamps instead. These are the bayonet cap version, which were just a nightmare because they've got little plastic pins that if you bumped it with a cherry picker, the pins would snap and the lights would just pop out like champagne corks. But aside from the fact these defeated the waterproofing, they also operated straight at 240. They let the water in, and they used these tiny little 10-watt tungsten 240-volt lamps, and they were prone to giving problems. But anyway, aside from this, it just, what I'm saying here is it was a spectacular display. It had little quirks. So the whole system was controlled by, it was installed by Northern Light, a theatre company in Scotland, and they used Strand lighting desks, like full-on computerized lighting desks, quite early computerized lighting desks, basically the ones that were left over in the hard department. And they used racks and racks of dimmers, and there were something like 200 channels of animation in the square. It was a really complex display. And when they were actually doing the sort of switch on, once this stuff had been put up, the programming team would come out. Someone from the hard department come out and program it. And they'd, because each hanging effect had its own animation sequence, so they'd all program as a string of cues, and then it would be sequenced such that when a certain time of day came, the switch on of the lights, it wasn't just a simple power up the square. It would sequence it up. The whole square would gently ramp up because it was all in dimmers, and then all the animation sequences would occur. That was problematic because the guys were not used to programming to a calendar, which meant that ultimately glitches in the programming would occur, and suddenly I'd go in and check the lights and nothing would be on. Then you'd have to go and manually boot it up from the desk. It's just teething troubles of a big, huge, complex computerized display. At the time, the network, there was an underground, some manhole covers with cables running underground, and it was a D54 network. D54 is an early theatre standard. It was for multiplexing lots of dimmers from just basically to minimise the amount of cabling. And it was an early standard. Later it switched to DMX, which is a more recognisable modern standard. But the D54 was quite interesting because it bridged the old analogue control, the not 10-volt control of dimmers, versus the more modern multiplex standard. And it did that by sending out a string of analogue voltage levels with synchronization pulses. And the dimmers, you'd set the address and it would count the number of pulses and then sample the voltage that it saw on the line, the 0 to 10 volts, and then it would actually store that, and that's what it would actually set the level of the lights at. So my involvement in this comes, I know this because my involvement comes that I still, I loved the Christmas lights. I should say those Christmas lights, when the display was ready and they put them up, all the big metal angels were covered with ultraviolet paint and lots of different they were painted in great detail in the ultraviolet paint and lit from below by ultraviolet uplighters, big 400-watt mercury lamps. And at the switch on, because nobody had ever seen rope light before and because of the scale it was done, it was just literally, it was like, can you imagine a new material that has never been seen before? Not just used a little bit here or there, but the scale of it, that they had hundreds of effects all around the square, big, huge, massive, animated three-dimensional effects. It caused a sensation. And countries from all around the world, they sent representatives to go and take photos and take a look at this, and it was widely copied in other cities. It was like taken as an example of here's the state-of-the-art Christmas lighting display, and that's fundamentally how the whole modern Christmas lighting industry was formed. And nowadays we just take it for granted. It's just like rope light, it's cheap. It's a ring light, by the way, I'm using. You may have noticed that. You probably saw it in the eyes. But nowadays you just think, oh, this is just cheap stuff. Back then, because it was so new, it really was crippling expensive. And when I got involved, I remember installing this stuff, and if I damaged a section, it was like, oh no, because, it was like £30 a metre for this stuff, and you got through quite a bit. It was maintenance intensive, it always was. But my involvement, I remember hearing about this new display and going in and going, wow, that is just immense. But one of the things that really stuck out was those ultraviolet angels. Latterly, they made them all white, but you looked up from below and it was these iridescent colours. Even during daylight, they looked weird. Because they were painted in fluorescent colours, it looked strangely like iridescent metal. It was fantastic. So my involvement comes, I say, I think that's an amazing lighting display. And I'm walking through the square and I see a guy in high-vis working on an electrical control panel at ground level, one of the pillars. And I just stroll over and, I'm usually quite shy about things, but I say hello and strike up conversation. It turns out it's Gordon Bell, who ended up my co-worker on George Square for decades, literally decades. And I say to him, I'd really like the lights. Do you guys ever need a hand putting them in? He said, well, I don't really know about that, but the best thing to do is contact this guy at the sort of Glasgow branch of Northern Light. So I called in there and I handed in my CV because I was at that point in time I was self-employed. I just finished with Thomas Johnson Shopfitters, a shop fitting company. I'd gone self-employed in a system called 714, whereby you get a tax card, and it means that you can go around companies and you can actually offer your services as an electrician, and they hire you as long as they need. It's part of Margaret Thatcher's first way of stripping down the workforce to make it sort of cheaper for her buddies to just hire and fire. But it suited me. It worked for me. So I called in at the Glasgow branch of Northern Light and I talked to the guy, and he's really chatty, and I think that was really nice. But I've had this experience in the past that things look really positive and then things don't turn out. But as it approaches Christmas, I wake up in the morning, there's a phone call, and it's this guy, and he says, "Are you still available?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely, yes." And he says, "Okay, go to this location. That's where we keep all the lights." And it was a place called Barmore Industrial Estate. It was one of the industrial units, and the place was just laid out with these lights inside. I arrived just as the other guys were arriving, and it's that whole first day in the job thing that you're a wee bit sort of timid, you're not really sure what's going to happen. But we go in and it's just all of these bells that I'd seen up high, all the angels, everything is in this big warehouse, and it's back when they were stored properly. Because all the bells were placed, they had feet and they were all placed on the ground to protect the tube light. And you could walk in amongst them. They were well enough spaced in a grid that you could walk amongst them and plug them up, see which bits lit, which bits didn't light, and then do repairs. So I start working with them doing repairs on the lights, and then we go onto the square and we install them. And I have to say, it was a complete rush, because to be involved in what was to me, such an epic display, it was great. But what I didn't realise was it would end up me and Gordon ran the job. But anyway, the years go on, and I can tell you more about the control systems because of that. And the quirks. Now, the representative for non-neon, and honestly, there were just tons of rolls of this stuff. I may have taken a few meters here and there. That's called pilferage, I believe. But originally, nowadays, the rope light would have glue-on end caps and connectors. In those days, it was this sort of, it was little collets, and it plugged together like this. It had these little caps that allowed it to plug together. And when you terminate it, it's got a sort of collet, a grip, and the spikes inside, and you'd push this connector on. And they kind of improved that since. It's a different way of doing it, and then you tighten this up. And unfortunately, the representative for non-neon in the UK was a bit misleading in information. And now, when I say what I'm about to say, some people who were more later involved in the last installation of the original George Square lights, it'll all make sense. They said it was double insulated, so because it was an architectural installation, they didn't want big, huge connectors and junction boxes and stuff all over the lights, and also there was nothing else to copy. It was the originals. So whereas you look at a modern Christmas light and it's got a little junction box on it, and it's got maybe a little waterproof connector that then connects the next one next, and you can sort of stack the lights, we had none of that. We were basically just making it up as we went along. So the connectors were little rubber connectors like these, domino connectors, which I've just dropped. Oh, hold on. And you know what? These little connectors were actually pretty good. But because it was classed as double insulated, because there was no junction box, because they didn't realise that was a good way to go, the cables literally came off the end of the rope light just into one of these connectors. And you basically, if the three swinging bells would have three of these connectors hanging from the flex run, and on the overhead catenary wire, you had a multi-core cable that would then fan out into the cores, which were sleeved and wrapped in tape, and then they'd go into these, just not waterproof at all, but then sometimes that's a good thing. These connectors were super reliable. You know, they had their downsides. Mainly, I think their biggest downside for me was when you're in a metal cherry picker and you're working the Christmas light and you say, right, I'm going to change that bit of rope light, and it's pissing with rain, the connector's wet, and you'd go up to pull it, even with gloves on, you'd start pulling it apart and it'd be like, ooh, right, a good zing, a good tingle off it. They were not suitable for handling. Latterly, I did switch to C-form, which was, you know, the sleeving arrangement meant that water got into the connectors, but with C-form, at least it tends to drain through them when they're set at the correct angle. And also, they've got anti-tracking in them. Although, having said that, these were super reliable connectors. They, you know, they were not ideal, but they were okay. Certainly, my choice at the end was to get the 3-pole ones and remove the middle pin, remove the middle socket, because water was going to get in. If you do that with these, the water drains through. And the only real problem we had with these was, after a long time, the contacts might arc in one, just through wear and tear, and then you'd go up to it to disconnect it, and you'd be wiggling and wiggling, and it just wouldn't come apart. No great deal. You just cut the flex, and next year you put a new plug and socket on. Where was I going with that? Yeah, so one of the things they said was it was double insulated. It wasn't. So the modern effects tend to have that little junction box on them, which also has the advantage of local fusing, which would have been really nice, but yeah, story behind that as well. The other thing that the sales agent for non-neon said was that once this is in, it's completely waterproof. You don't need any other waterproofing. Once it's just pushed in, tightened up, that's it. No, not even by close. You know, that was so far from reality. One of the biggest problems they had in George Square was water ingress to connectors, and even when it moved on to the glue-on connectors, even with amalgamating tape, it was always the big problem was water sneaking its way into connectors, either down the inside the flex or just through pinholes in the insulation material you had on them. Exciting times. What can I say now? Let me think. So we hung these, and they were heavy. I'm trying to think. I don't want to miss any of the story here. I'm trying to think of things that went through. As the job went on, it got downsized. There was always the money-saving thing. So this was quite a complex display, but over time, it got less and less. So it ended up they got rid of the lower catenary wires, because originally when we went in, it wasn't just the team. We were on the square for quite some time. Initially, it was 8 weeks we were doing the Christmas lighting installation, because it wasn't just on the square. It was those multiple layers on the square plus all the surrounding area around George Square. We also did the lighting, including a lot of the trees. So it was actually pretty much, it kept me occupied for quite some time. In the end, it was reduced considerably to about 3 or 4 weeks. And even that time, we'd be doing other jobs with Northern Light off the square, just when it was quiet. Let me think. So Harry Tegan, one of the other things he did, because it was the prototypes again, there was no concept of keeping things manageable. These days, it tends to be rectangular aluminium or square aluminium frames that either bolt together or just hang on their own. But everything was being invented as we went along, because it was the prototypes of the industry. So you ended up with frames that actually interlocked. So one frame would actually come down. Nothing was square, nothing. You had to actually really think about how these things went together. And in some of the earliest ones, including notably, if you can find pictures of them anywhere, the peacocks, it was white rope light, but it had been hand painted by Harry Tegan, so it was like a full spectrum of colours. It didn't work that well. It was kind of dark, and all the paint came off in your hands because it did not cure properly on the plastic. But they also, when you actually put the lights up, there were sections rolled up that then actually came down. When you bolted the metal frames together, you had to actually unroll the rope light from sections and take it down into the other frames. It just wasn't designed for easy installation because, as I say, it was the prototypes of the industry. When you look at your Christmas lights now, they are, honestly, they're derived from the George Square installation. It was like the prototype. So time goes on and they're gradually reducing it. Harry Tegan sort of leaves the scene. John Toffolo takes over. And Glasgow Council is not noted for being very good at making decisions. So this thing starts that every year is the last year for the Christmas lights. And I think I was there for over 10 years. Every year was the last year. And they were going to get rid of the big metal poles round George Square. Oh, that's also reminded me of the poles. The poles they're put in, we were told, we're going to cut holes in these poles for you to run the cables up, because it was underground ducts with all the cables going up and coming out the tops of the poles. And the poles also were later adapted to, I don't know if they had that from the beginning, but they were designed to take banners. And during the year, they're covered, so they've got big sailcloth type banners on both sides that are either printed or sort of sewn together in quite complex mosaics. They're actually really rugged. They withstand the weather well, and they look pretty good. You can see that if you look up the film World War Z. The George Square is representing part of America in that. So they've got all these banners that are like the Philadelphia Museum or something like that, but it was actually George Square in Glasgow, and you can see the banners there. We were told that under no circumstances do you ever drill these poles other than the holes that you've requested, or ever put metal in those poles. So everything was plastic. Even the plastic junction boxes were held on with plastic straps. It kind of looked a bit rough, but you know, it turned out actually a really good idea, because it meant that they lasted for ages. And because it was held on with plastic straps, and because it was early on, we just had loose terminal block inside tied onto those straps. It was, you know, we never had a problem with those junction boxes. Subsequently, Glasgow Council came out and they put floodlights on the top of the poles, and they put on the waterproof junction box. And I can remember opening one of them, and I was up in the cherry picker, and the guys had said, "Could you check out our lights while you've got the cherry picker there?" So I went up and one of the lights wasn't working. I opened the ballast box and it was just this manky water just went douche all down the front and then smacked off the ground down below. So that said, you know, the plastic box, the drainage holes, I've always said it's one of the best ways. That kind of proved that if you make a case too watertight, water just builds up in it. Because the material was always presented as like being double insulated, and because the design was supposed to be sort of minimalist and minimise the size of the connectors and so on, earthing was also done through the actual steel wire ropes. That is covered in the regulations where you can use structural steel as earthing, but to make sure it was a good earth, we had to, on the three sides of the square where we had three different control cabins, we had a big earth wire going up to the top, coming out, going onto a common stud, and then it would then fan out, bond onto the catenary wires, and then fan out along. So everything, when you hooked one of these big steel frames onto the upper catenary wire, it earthed it as well, and it was actually really good earth. We did the full electrical test on a regular basis to check everything was okay, and never got a bad reading. It was very good earth continuity, super low resistance. Let me think. So, as time went on, the job gradually, it got more and more efficient. It got reduced until it was just the upper catenary wires and the hanging effects and a few things like the nativity scene, the Water Scott monument, and like the main Christmas tree. So the timescale would be that typically we'd move on to the square. We'd get our porta-cabin in. The porta-cabin doubled up in the end, as we used to have three porta-cabins. There's a story behind that as well. It's a bit disgusting, I'll tell you. We used to have three porta-cabins because we used a lot of dimmers initially, and they were quite big because it was the old style dimmers. And we used one on the lawn next to where they have the Remembrance service, and the police used to actually take up residency in our cabin, while we were off the square, and they used to sort of use it as a base. And one year we came back after Christmas to take the lights down, and the police had been using it as a cabin, and the urn, the tea urn, was full to the brim, because we just went in, checked the level, took the lid off. It was full to the brim with piss. They'd been urinating in the urn, and they'd just basically filled it right up to the very top, and then left the urn absolutely full of piss. And that was the last time the police ever used our cabin. It was also the last time that urn was used, because yeah, that's unsavoury. Nice story. So we used to have three smallish porta cabins that were used for storing materials and also for the control systems. And that gradually, because we gradually slimmed things down, we ended up building shelving in the main power incoming point to the square. Power, that's an interesting thing. The square has a 800 amp 3-phase feed into it at 244 15 volts. Excuse me, I'm just going to have some more dark and stormy. Sorry. So good. Dark and stormy, just like George Square, as many of the people who have subsequently worked on the Christmas lights can tell you. It's very, very exposed, and for some reason it just seems to catch diagonal wind. It's quite a ruthless place to work. Dark and stormy, yeah, the porta cabins, yeah, we had the supply come onto the square was a 3-phase, 800 amps per phase. We typically had, on each of those cabins, 3 cabins, we had 3-phase 100 amps. At the peak of that, when we had so much animation, so much equipment on the square, excluding the stuff that was independently controlled from the streetlights, because we used to use the council's street lighting supply for some stuff. Not sure if they knew about that. But we also had catenary wires going across earlier on when we had more features on them. But the current draw was such, it was like pushing it. It was maybe about 80, 90 amps per phase. We had to make sure it was well balanced. And if the programmer, we had to always remind them, there are 3 circuits of bells, only one can be lit at a time, don't ever light anymore. And if you went up to the desk and you just typed 1 through 512 at full, just bring all the channels on, as I accidentally did once, it blows all the fuses. Yeah, because the power was high enough for all those effects that it exceeded 100 amps a phase. Latterly, with LED, that came down dramatically, but it was a big display. The porta cabins, is there anything really worth saying? We slimmed it down. With the electrical cabin, we put some shelving inside it, and we ended up, as the job got smaller, and particularly when we switched to LED, it gradually required sort of less power, so we could actually scale the number of dimmers and circuits down. The job became just me and Gordon were the main people on it. We'd move on, we'd get our porta cabin on, our main sort of store porta cabin, and then a couple of guys would come from Mad Tour Resources. They are actually called Mad Tour Resources. It's named after the initials of the directors of Mad Tour Resources. So they'd come on as crew, and we'd have a truck driver and a crane driver, and we'd just shuttle it down a bay at a time, and I'd get a cherry picker and start putting the stuff up. So to do it, it typically took a lot of work, but it typically took about 2 weeks, but it wasn't hard pressed. The fastest it was ever done was when Northern Light was super busy. I was working over in Paris at the time at Disney, and we were so, it was such a rush, and nobody really knew the way that the lights go up. So I actually flew back from Disney, and in 1 week, just 5 days with 2 trucks and a lot of hours, we actually put everything up in George Square in just 1 week. So it wasn't an easy week by any stretch of imagination. So 2 weeks was about the right time to do that. But typically speaking, we'd have 2 of the Mad Tour guys, just basically roadies, helping carry the stuff down. The crane driver, truck driver, and me and Gordon slinging stuff up, me going up in the cherry picker and hanging it. That was what the team. So it would start off the 2 weeks that the stuff would go up, and then after that, there'd be a sort of quiet week that we'd sometimes be off the square, but we'd be getting the dimmers in and stuff like that, and building up the control systems and plugging it up and testing it. And then the final week, ready for the switch on, would be other stuff would arrive. We'd do the Walter Scott Monument, all the rope light down it. and the lights at the base. As it approached the switch on, the tree would arrive in the square. It happened round about the time of the Remembrance service. They have a Remembrance service for fallen veterans of the war, so to speak, and it's on the 11th of November. But they have that, and then all the low level stuff comes in. There's nothing put at low level before that point. It's just with respect for the victims of war. But then me and Gordon would just hook all that stuff up, put laterally 10,000 LEDs on the tree. It looked very good, and then do the switch on. And after that, because I like the square, and because initially in the early days, well, through and through, because of the nature of the lights, they used to be quite temperamental. I used to call by the square on a regular basis and just check it was okay, and if anything cut out, I'd go and reset it. That brings another thing up. So I'd go and reset things. If a channel had failed, as sometimes happens in the bells, just because they got rough treatment in storage. I had a system, latterly I wrote a bit of software on the Leighton desk that it just had a channel that faked operation of the bell. Because the bells swung in 3 channels, if one of the bell circuits failed and went out completely and took all the others in that row out, it would be really obvious, because it would be 1, 2, blank, 2, 1, 2, blank, and the whole line would just go out. So I had a bit of software in the line desk, just added an extra channel that if there were only 2 bells left working, it would just alternate between them. It would just make it sort of, it never went dark. It still went in sequence with all the other lights, but it didn't do the full swing. It just shuttled backwards and forwards. It worked very well. In the early days, because these little lamps in here were very prone to blowing, these little 10-watt lamps, every time one blew, it would go with a bang, and it would usually take out the dimmer. So that's when Keith, the hire manager at Glasgow, would actually come out, and every evening he'd come out, see if something had blown up and put a new fuse in it. It's just because of these lights they used. And certainly before the switch on, me and Gordon would go around with boxes of these little lights and do a huge relamping. I'm so glad these are away. They were nice, these lights, but they were so volatile. They caused lots of problems. There's another story about that. When I first worked there, the guys I was working with were Gordon Bell and Willie Bell, who were based at the Glasgow branch. Willie Bell is a veteran of the theatre industry. He started with Strand's installation department. You've probably heard Strand, Rank Strand, now owned by Philips, the Strand group. And so he was a veteran, but he was very old school. He's one of the old scary riggers that, he would actually climb girders and then tightrope walk along things, and it was like, oh no, you'd be looking at him on he'd be up in lighting gantries and theatres, and you'd be like, oh God, I hope he doesn't fall. But just because he was a traditional rigger, he just didn't. It's all safety, it's all harnesses and stuff like that now. But he had a set of sort of tightrope walker's shoes, sort of ballet type shoes he used to put on, so he could actually basically wrap his feet around the girders. Very odd, very old school. But being old school, he also had the older style of work, and he was also he taught me, well, various knots and things that are associated with the theatre industry. And by taught, I mean that if I tied a knot wrong, he'd just absolutely tear into me. He was so unsubtle. And you soon learn how to tie things and do the job properly according to Willie's way that he wants it done. Yeah. Quite liked Willie, but he was quite a nippy sweetie, as they say in Scotland. So, oh yes, Willie showed me an interesting technique. This is just silly. Every so often, because water got into the lamp holders, the festoon would fail and a section of the thing would go out, and you'd be up there and you'd be taking every single lamp cap out. Is it black and sooty? Sniff, no, it's fine. Stick it back in, take the next one out. And Willie comes across and says, what are you doing? And I said, I'm trying to find, it keeps blowing the fuse or tripping the breaker. I can't find which cap's actually faulty. And he says, watch this. He plugged it into a 5K dimmer rack, which is cable a lot more current, got this little strand console with the 6 faders. MD who worked with those dimmers will know the old strand sort of Act 6 type console. And he says, watch this. I looked up at the light, this frame, this Christmas frame, and he just ramped it up in the dimmer. Just one of the lamp caps just went, this fireball came out. And then he said, there you go. And I went up and you could see which cap was the faulty one because it was the black and sooty one. I have to say, yeah, not the best way to find it, but a fun way to find it. I have to admit, perhaps I did use that as a last resort. It was quite an enjoyable experience. Those Christmas lights, the early ones, because just of the way they were made, because water got in, because they were the prototypes, they used to go bang quite a lot in an exciting way. It was... now, after we made it all safe and friendly with LED, I kind of regretted not filming something blowing up deliberately. Oh well. Anyway, let me think. The job kind of became my baby as such. I would call by, I'd check it almost every night. Basically speaking, because I was freelance, we'd do the switch on. I'd maybe come back for one day after the switch on, just finishing off odds and ends, getting some lights that might not have been put out deliberately, just because the public were in. And then I'd leave, I'd finish. But because I just loved the job so much, whenever I was in the city centre, I'd just wander by and just check. So it was always well maintained because I was just checking in and making sure that stuff was reset and stuff like that. There were knock-on effects to this because I started doing Christmas lights in Northern Light and did it for over 20 years. But then when they needed help and other stuff, I ended up working with them freelance, doing theatre equipment installation because I'm good at electrical and electronic stuff, soldering all the terminations and their patch panels. And I even ended up on the books full-time with them when Willie retired for a while, and until I realised that full-time employment's not all it's cracked up to be, you know. Self-employment is better. And I went back out, still worked with Northern Light, but just went back out self-employed again with them, which they were fine with. John Toffolo. John Toffolo, have I mentioned this? I don't think I have. John Toffolo took over from Harry Tegan, and whereas Harry Tegan didn't take any nonsense from the councillors, as all this funding was going down, Harry Tegan would push for more funding and, you know, I want this, and he'd be quite forceful and get his way. John Toffolo wasn't quite as pushy, so it gradually sort of reduced over time. And the one thing that John Toffolo did that was spectacular was, did I mention this? He got a lighting company to come in, and I'm not sure if I didn't. Yes, he got a lighting company to come in, and they refurbished all the lighting, the flood lighting. They replaced all the lamps, cleaned everything up on the city chambers, but they also put dichroic filters in front of the lights, pink and yellow, and it was fantastic. The city chambers, as well as all the sort of animated Christmas lights, the city chambers looked like a fairy tale castle. It was just these lovely, vibrant colours. And that lasted about 2 years until one councillor said, I don't like the pink light coming in through the window of my office, and had it all vetoed. That's the story, that's the history of George Square, can be potted up in whiny councillors that, you know, just gradually reduce it over time. So it did evolve over time. We gradually made the transition to LED. Now, another thing that was happening, and this, it turns out that LED is not suited to all applications. It was a problem with the bells. The hang effects fine. The hollies were fine, although they did need a good servicing at the end. But the bells were just not compatible with the LED. And the reason for that is that if you look at modern LED rope light, it has a hollow core down the middle of it. And if that core gets damaged, water can get in and can migrate along inside it. And because it's DC, it causes electrolytic corrosion. And that results in flashover inside. And when it does, flash over, it kills the rectifier that's built into the end cap. Whereas these just had a sort of mains end cap at the end. With LED stuff, there's a little discrete rectifier inside it to convert the AC to DC for the rope light. And the bells did suffer damage because Whereas they used to be stored in a big huge warehouse that was dedicated to them, and there were hooks for all the other effects, and the angels actually had sort of spigots come out the wall and stood up the way, and you could actually hook the angel on, which wasn't actually that easy because they weighed a ton. Because of they used to have this big warehouse, and we used to use a truck with a small crane in the back and lift the stuff off quite gently. Ultimately, laterally, we just ended up just lifting it off manually. It was faster. But the bells were never put under pressure. They were just actually sitting on their little feet on the floor. They were secure. Unfortunately, money crept in and they decided to use that unit for something else. And the engineering company that maintained the sort of lights, they offered to store them. And they put them in a much smaller area and said they'd invented a new way that we're going to store the bells. And they made this cube system that the bells could be stacked too high. And these were just too high as in the number 2, but also too high as in TOO. They were too high. It was very awkward lifting them down. They had an idea of using a crane, but then that didn't happen. So they ended up not just on these things which put a lot of pressure against the rope light and damaged it, but then they moved to another store and they just mushed the lights into a corner, and every year we'd take the lights down and we came back to service them. They had just literally been compressed as tight as possible into a corner. All the flat holly frames had been crushed against each other, just everything being compacted in just to make as much space in the workshop as possible. And it damaged the rope light. It actually pierced the outer insulation and it caused a lot of problems with water ingress to the bells. And because the bells basically used a whole roll of rope light per bell because they were big complex three-dimensional bells, that air void inside that the modern construction is, whereas the old stuff was a solid plastic core, the modern construction has a sort of hollow channel down it that the LEDs and the wiring are placed into and then tacked across the bus bars. More are placed in, tacked across bus bars. And because of that, if there was a pinhole, the thermal expansion contraction of that whole long length of the rope light in sunlight and then the cold of night, it caused thermal cycling that sucked moisture in, and it caused a lot of problems with them failing. It's one of these things that, yeah, they could have done with a reinvention. Also, every time we retube them, I'd say, this is a perfect opportunity. We can get a little metal plate put on, we can get a junction box put on, and we can put a fuse in it, and we can actually subdivide it all down. We can put proper connectors. Harry's away, we can actually put like junction boxes on the overhead continuity wires, and we can actually redo it. No, they just never, ever wanted to improve them in any way, which is a shame, because that's probably what contributed to the end as such, because the reliability sort of went downhill. Let me think, is there anything else that's worth covering in that regard? Is there anything worth mentioning in the lights with that regard? I don't think there is. I think that's pretty much covered. So, time goes on and my dad passes away and I'm looking after my mum. She's got Alzheimer's and I'm spending a lot more time because I'm self-employed. I've got the freedom that I can choose not to work all the time. I can actually travel over. And I start traveling, I start spending a month. Me and my brother decide that we're going to give my mum freedom. You know, although she's got early Alzheimer's, she's still managing on her own. And we'll give her the freedom of, just because there was always a bit of a relationship between my mum and dad that, you know, we thought it would be beneficial for her to have some free time. So I was travelling over a month there, month back, and stocking up the larder, getting all the food and stuff in, and maintaining the place and making sure she was okay, and spend lots of time with her. And Ralph would also shuttle backwards and forwards. And when I was doing things like George Square, that would then, Ralph would go across while I was doing that, and likewise when I was doing the Ember Military Tattoo, he would also go across, look after my mum while I was like tied up and work. So it's a time that, you know, it was getting a wee bit difficult, and I couldn't, as soon as I'd finished installing the lights, I couldn't stay in Glasgow. I had to go over and look after my mum, which meant that, you know, when things went out, they didn't get reset. Gordon didn't really do proactively, didn't really come and check the lights were still working. So sections would go out, but it was still acceptable. You just accepted that some of the stuff went out. It usually still happens with Christmas lights. Anywhere you go, you'll see sections out. But it's a time that's, it was getting quite hard. And then a company decided they wanted the George Square work, and things started getting pretty unpleasant on George Square because one of those companies decided to use health and safety as a weapon. And if you, no matter what you do, you can look at some working, you can pick out safety violations because it doesn't matter what you do. There's a safety violation to match. It's just that the way it is. So, despite the fact that Northern Light over the course of 25 years had a 100% safety record, I can't think of any incident occurred that any of the crew got injured or any member of the public got injured or anything. It was a completely safe time. The only thing I can think of that would come as an incident on the square is when one of our cherry pickers, one of the hydraulic hoses blew or a seal blew, and a safety mechanism kicked in. It wasn't a cherry picker, it was actually an aerial access platform, but it squirted oil all over the square. But they've got the contingency plan, they've got all the things to control that, so the sort of absorbent things that they put down. So it's not really what you'd call, it's just a standard incident. It's not the first time we've had a cherry picker pop a hydraulic line, but that's the only really major incident I can think of. Pretty good safety record. But anyway, a company decides they want the job and they're going to use malicious tactics against Northern Light. And I don't know which company it was. There were a couple of companies vying for the work. So the first thing that happens is a guy comes on and says he's from the health and safety executive and demands, or I assume he was from the health and safety executive, but he demands to see our IPAF and GIB certificates. Now, IPAF is the International Powered Access Federation. If you drive a cherry picker, you have to pay them protection money on an ongoing basis. It's this silly thing in the construction industry in Britain that scaffold building, safety, cherry picker driving, you go on these one-day slideshow courses, really, it's hard to fail. But then you get a certificate, and because you get a certificate, you're now allowed to use one, but it expires after 5 years. And then you have to go and resit the test, and then it expires after 5 years. It's a money-making scam, really. It's nothing more than a protection racket. You wouldn't, if I told you that, you're going to have to sit your driving test every 5 years, you wouldn't be happy about it. That's pretty much how most construction workers feel about IPAF. It's just an outright scam, but that's just how it is. But either way, we did have our IPAF, and they asked to see GIB, and because I've got my technician level GIB card, that was fine as well. So they went away. And then the council said that we've been targeted again. Like they're saying we have to, because you're on the square for X amount of time, we have to have a site office, they're saying. So I don't know who this company was. Weird shit. So that because the square was run by Field and Lawn, not Field and Lawn, that's who later took the job on, and Lightways. Field and Lawn, I'm saying that because it's the Parks Department. That's why Field and Lawn Parks Department. Okay. So the Parks Department bring on this sort of mobile office, and it's a safety office, and they tow it on, and they've got a Land Rover tows it on, then they leave it there. So as soon as we start in the square, this safety office arrives on the square, and there's 4 safety officers in it, which is 1 each, which is very generous. And they're a bit embarrassed because they know it's just silly, it's just politics that this company's playing, but they have to go with it because they've stirred up the shit. And even after the guys have gone, we're like, after the 2 weeks of the main installation, me and Gordon are basically standing there on the square, putting dimmers in, and we're outnumbered 2 to 1 by safety officers. And you're thinking, this is actually getting quite annoying. Then the company targets us, saying that because we're putting stuff up the crane, that we should have slinging certificates. And the way we're doing it, it's just Christmas light. It's nothing really major. It's the crane driver used to say, "Do you want one of our slings?" And it used to be pull out these big, huge, muddy slings. So with the crane driver's advice, we got the softer slings, and for safety reasons and for certification, we just got a complete new one every year. And it was grossly overrated for the task. It was like the biggest sling we could comfortably fit through the frames. So we'd use a new sling every year. We'd thread it through the strongest, most structural part of the light. It was done sensibly. But anyway, targeted us for not being certified slingers. And Northern Light gets in touch with the company, and this old guy comes out, works the crane industry, and puts us through a little on-site slinging test to tick that box as well. And he says, oh, you're fine, you seem to know what you're doing. And he says, I'm going to check what you're doing out there with the lights. So he goes out and says, I don't know why I'm here. You've done it perfectly. You've been doing it perfectly. It's fine. So then the next thing, we're putting the lights up, and this guy turns up and says, hi, I've come here to supervise your installation of the Christmas lights for safety reasons. I'm an independent safety officer. And you think, really? And he says, I've got concerns that your Christmas lights might go out of control while on the crane. And it's just like nonsense. He goes to the boot of his car and brings out a rope with a metal hook on the end, hooks it onto the Christmas light, and then stands on the ground with a slack rope just sort of looking about as I go up. And then he says, oh, and once you get up there, just unhook it and throw it down. So this is a guy who's promoting himself as some sort of safety guy. He says that I should be throwing steel rigging hook, that's which I regard rigging hardware, from 50 feet down onto tarmac, which you don't drop hooks. It can actually, ultimately, it can fracture them if they land badly. And, well, it can fracture your colleagues' skulls if it lands on top of them. But it's just this doubtful thing. And he gets bored standing there because if it was really stormy weather, like windy enough that the lights were going to go out of control, we wouldn't be working because you have to consider the side loading of wind on a cherry picker, and it gets pretty unpleasant. And on George Square, if the wind does get up, it really is. Long before the Christmas lights will be going out of control, because they are wire frame, they're designed to actually handle wind and not get disturbed by it. Long before that, you wouldn't be going up in the cherry picker, you'd be just sort of conning it off until the actual wind went down. But he gets bored, and he says, do you know MD who can do this, and I'll just pay them. And the crane driver suggested another crane driver who'd been laid off by Hoodens. Hooden Cranes had been bought over by an investment company who had just been trying to slim the company down to maximise their profit, and they eventually ran it into the ground. Long story short, they'd paid off one of their best crane drivers, Big Ross Hendry. Same height as me, 6'4", much broader, quite an unusually, everything was in proportion. He was a really big guy. And that meant his eyes were actually just a tiny bit further apart. You could see this thing that he had quite a wide ocular distance, and it gave him this incredible depth perception that when he was actually hanging stuff, he literally, you put the sling through, and by the time you got up there in the cherry picker, he'd just glide it up from a great distance and hook it on perfectly first time himself. He was just really good crane driver. So anyway, he was unemployed at the time. He came out, and his job was just to stand there with the rope attached to the Christmas light. Even a little tiny star, there'd have to be a rope attached to it because of this politics that was going on. And then I discovered that I was charging £16 an hour, and Ross was being paid about 50% more, and the guy that was employing him was taking a huge slice as well. So this safety guy and Ross were effectively making more money standing there with the rope, or not even, the safety guy wasn't even there, than I was doing the installation of the lights. And that kind of gets a bit, it's just all adding up. Then this man and woman appear on the square, and they take shifts, and they've got a DSLR camera with a long range zoom lens, and they're just filming everything we do. And that, okay, you see a lot of people in George Square with a camera because ultimately it's the biggest city in Scotland. It's got a huge tourist industry, and George Square is a sort of tourist thing, I guess. So the difference is that they're filming us, and they're really obviously filming us. And more importantly, the guy in particular, when we cordoned off, we actually closed off with barriers areas where we're working to keep the public out. But obviously, when you're moving the cherry picker out, you have to actually open the barriers. And as soon as I'd be driving the cherry picker out, the guy would be he'd have the camera, and he'd come down and he'd be cheating his shot. He'd be trying to get under, get the right angle to make it look as though the basket was somehow over the head of members of the public who were like miles away in the distance. You could see from what he was doing, he was like cheating shots for sort of presumably to paint a picture of health and safety violations. And one day when he was away, right, so tallish guy, business suit, dark hair, and the woman was this short, fat lady with a pink top and sort of blonde hair. I'm pretty sure I took a picture of her. Wonder where that is. I didn't take a picture of him, wish I had, because if I'd known what was going to happen. Anyway, all this politics. The woman's there, and I'm working on the Walter Scott Monument, and because the Walter Scott Monument is surrounded entirely by a garden, it's basically solid mud. You can't put a scaffold on it, you can't put ladders on it, but you also can't reach certain areas, the plateau at the bottom, from the cherry picker. So I'd commonly climb out the cherry picker, and if you look at the iPath regulations of the past, they said you must never gain access to something with a cherry picker. But latterly, they relaxed that because they realised that, yeah, as long as it's done properly, and the last time I did my iPath, I raised this subject and said, you know, this is what I do, and here's why I do it, because it's the only safe way to gain access. And I allow for the fact that the hydraulics have a bit of give, and if air gets into the system, it can be quite springy, the basket, when you take your weight off it. So what I do is I go up to level with the thing that I can step off safely. I keep my harness on, hooked into the cherry picker. I take my weight off slowly, let it stabilise, and then move the attachment point to where I'm hooking onto. So it was all done completely in compliance with iPath and everything. But not in the eyes of this woman with the camera, because she's actually ranting and screaming. She's like looking around for attention and shouting at people, "That's a safety violation! That's a safety violation!" She's really obvious, the camera, going, "I'm taking pictures." What the fuck was up with her? And like at this point in time, you know, all the stress of like looking after my mum and just, you know, a job that I really loved is just getting too much. And this is compounded by the fact that there were other politics. The Glasgow event department was doing they were putting an ice rink in George Square, and it didn't really make much money for it. I think it was a big loss maker, but I get the feeling that the licensed premises did quite well on the ice rink arrangement, so the event department were under pressure to get on sooner and sooner. And in the past, it used to be that the Christmas light switch on would involve the whole square. It would be completely empty, so you could fill it with as many people as possible. And it, you know, every year the Christmas light switch on, they have to ration the number of people who can get onto it, because otherwise, you know, well, the streets around Glasgow, it's a big thing in Glasgow. The start of Christmas, it's a huge thing. So it used to be tens of thousands of people would be on the square for this switch on. And at various times it was done from the top of a double-decker bus by the provost, or we'd decorate the provost's balcony outside a room in the city chambers, and we get a cherry picker with a photo spot on it to light that, and the sermon would happen there. Or sometimes it was done from a stage. It was just done in various styles. But the pressure to get that ice rink on started creeping in, and they'd start building it before the lights had been switched on, and that meant that the place was just a minefield. It was just a building site. You couldn't fit as many people in, and for our perspective, it made it very difficult, because everything was happening at the end. It made access to the Christmas tree that was being delivered much harder, to the point that the final year, like, me and Gordon had one day to actually put 10,000 lights in the tree. Not one day, we had an afternoon, really, and it was pushing it to the very edge. You're wondering when you're going to get there. And we're testing the lights. We usually did a soak test before the switch on, because the time they're going to fail is if the lights you're going to have any problem. Uh-oh, awkward jump cut, because the phone decided to corrupt the last bit of video, so let's record that again, shall we? Technology, it's the future. So, where was I? I was George Square. What we used to do was, if you got a big switch on with like crowds of people, like thousands of people turning up to see a switch on and count down to it, you get a bit paranoid. You want to make sure everything is lit. So what we used to do was we left the lights in soak test in the run up to the switch on. During the day, we'd just leave them on all the time. So if something was going to fail, it would fail then, and we could fix it. Because in the lights, it's usually early on that stuff does go. And even better if it rained, because that kind of like soaked all the connections and made sure everything was watertight. So if something did go out, when the ice rink was on the square, when they were building it, because it was a building site, you couldn't just jump the cherry picker and go over and fix a light. It meant that you had to negotiate basically a building site with vehicles and materials everywhere, and you had to keep jumping at the cherry picker and dragging materials out of the way and asking people to move their vehicles. It just turned that into a chore. It just made a simple 5-minute job like a multi-hour job. So in the end, well, basically speaking, I've had enough of that job. And I talked to my brother and say, although at this point, my brother has moved in with my mum to look after her. And she's going through her Alzheimer's terrible teens, the sort of one of the most awkward stages was just before she did end up completely bedbound, that she was really active and getting up to mischief. So I told my brother, well, I really love that job. I don't want to lose it, but I can't handle all the sort of harassment. And while the income's valuable, what should I do? And he said, well, just let the job go because it's going to be easy. It's just at this time, it's quite handy that you're here to help look after mum anyway, because like she was needing that extra attention. So the following year when Northern Light phoned up and said, are you coming back to join us? Here's the date we're starting. I said, I'm really sorry. I can't come back this year because I have to look after my mum. And that was actually the last year that Northern Light did the job. I'm not sure what happened the next year. It was 2015, I think it was. Northern Light had been bought over at that point by Stage Electrics. I don't know if that was a factor in it or they just had plans to change the lights anyway. But the job got taken over by a company called Field and Lawn. Field and Lawn is an events company. They're called Field and Lawn because their main business is kind of putting up tents and fields for weddings and sporting events. But in a way, the events industry is kind of well suited to Christmas lighting because it's designed for bursts of activity. And I suppose really Christmas lighting is an event in a way. So what they do is they have a core crew and then they bring in extra other crew as needed, sort of casual labour. They can just bring it in from a pool they can sort of pull on as needed. It's just the way the events industry works. And they've kind of really dominated the Christmas lighting in the UK a lot. They've taken on a lot of work in the UK. I think they're sort of, I don't know if they're actually subbing out to other event companies, but that's how it kind of seems to be working. And they pull in local labour again to actually do the work. And they put up the original Christmas lights, and it must have been just an absolute nightmare for them, because if they were used to just the modern, absolutely super lightweight, one hand picks it up, one plug, one socket, dead easy, just so easy to hook up and plug end to end, they got a bit of a fright when they installed the original George Square ones. I wonder if they realised that they were basically the prototypes of the entire modern electrical lighting, the Christmas lighting industry. But they did a valiant job. They got the angels up, all craned up. They got the upper catenary. They got the hanging effects. Well, most of them, there were bits missing. And I don't know if the weather was kind to them, but they had to cancel, for the first time ever, they had to cancel the switch on of the Christmas lights on George Square. And it was put down to bad weather, and if it was bad weather, then that would just have been the icing on the cake for those old effects, because you are very exposed while you're putting them up in George Square, and water gets in to connectors. It just causes problems. And I visited Glasgow. I always pop over to Glasgow at Christmas to do my Christmas shopping, mainly stuff for me. Christmas lights and gadgets and modules, anything that's interesting. And also to visit friends. It's always worth visiting for that. And I thought, oh, this is a good chance to go and take a video of the Christmas lights in George Square, because I never ever did that, and it's something I wish I had done, just to at least take pictures of some of the effects, just in case they get scrapped. And I went out there and I made a video, but I've never actually shown it. It still exists, but what a disappointment. There was so much out. There was lots out in the upper catenaries. The hanging effects, which were normally pretty reliable, there was no animation at all on them. It was just, they were just powered static. And a lot of it was out. I mean, literally, when I went round, about 50% of the hanging effects were just out, just dead. The Walter Scott Monument, which is quite a central bit, I always used to put a lot of work into putting the rope light up in that. It was dark. It was off. The Christmas tree, they'd used a small number of lights and they basically wigwammed it. Now, wigwamming is a term in the Christmas lighting scene that if you put lights in the tree in straight lines, if you use too few, it looks very just like straight lines. And we've done that in the past when LED lights first came out and we first put them on the tree and it was the latest thing, you know, wow, LED lights. They didn't give us enough and it looked very wigwammy. Those veterans of those fans of Christmas lighting might remember the year that it was the big blue pear in George Square because it outlined the tree and the tree was kind of twisted at the same time, so it made it look like a big blue pear. Really odd effect. But that was the last year for the original Christmas lights. They had them scrapped after that, as far as I know. And Field and Lawn the following year imported some catalogue frames. They got sort of generic flat white frames, which makes sense because they take up less space in storage. They're much easier to install. And I kind of disappoint that they're white, they're all white, and they're all the same effect. All the hanged effects down the poles are the same tree on every single pole. And the upper catenaries, it's the standard square commercial frames with star, snowflake, star, snowflake, cold white, warm white, all round. Now, the reason I kind of dislike white is that it's a bit old-fashioned. I mean, white used to be the only real colour choice you had in the early days of Christmas lighting because it was tungsten lighting. And if you added colour filters to actually change the colour, particularly blue or green, it made them look very dark. But with modern LEDs, you've got much more variety. You've got the blue, green, red and orange. Not so sure about the yellow. Yellow always looks a bit washed out. Plus the cold white and warm white. And if you, depending on the supplier or reliability, you can also get the pinks and purples as well in rope light. And it just adds that. To me, Christmas is about colour. It's like, it's all for the kids as such. It's not some adult architectural display. And if the kids enjoy it, it's like pantomime. If the kids are having fun, the parents have fun too. It's just because they like the pleasure that the kids are enjoying themselves. But they put these panels up, and they were the ones that just plug end to end, hook them on, and they've got a plug-in socket, and you just hook them end to end. And the control system appears to have been changed to time switches. Just there's 3 sides to the square, 3 powered sides, and there was a time switch on each side. You could tell that because when they light up, and they don't just all come on together. One side lights, and then another side lights, and then the other side lights at different times, and likewise when going off. And I don't know what happened. It was in the newspaper saying it's the new fantastic Christmas lighting display, and it all switched on and everything went fine. And then for some reason, huge sections of it started going out to the point that there was another newspaper headline. Newspapers are just, it's not good. The newspapers used to say, "Hi, can we take a picture of you putting the lights up?" And you'd say, "Yeah, okay," and you'd pose for them. And then it would appear in the newspaper and say, "Christmas lights going up this time already." It's like, it was always, they'd use it in some negative way, and it's like, oh, it's the same old shit going up again. But they managed to hit the headlines, unfortunately, with Glasgow's showcase lights leave the square in the dark. And because they were on just a small number of circuits, and because there were so many, and there was no multiple channels as such, it meant that whole sections were out and it left it dark. So that was odd, and they were out for quite a while. They didn't like try and bypass the bits that were faulty and bring the rest back on. They were out until they got all the bits they needed, spares, and then they fixed it. And that was the last year Field and Lawn did it, unfortunately. The following year, Lightways took it over, a street lighting company, and they used the existing Field and Lawn white frames, but they did something interesting. I really approved of it. It made a huge difference. On the upper catenary, it was like the square frames, but then there was a square frame, and then a gap, and then a square frame, then a gap, and it did look very sparse. What they did, they got more of the square frames, but they got the most simplest ones possible. No rope light or anything on them. They were just like the LED light zigzagged up and down with the sort of sparkly points, you know, the ones that are self-flashing LEDs. and they put those in between the stars and snowflakes, and that made a huge difference because it meant that it actually created a continuous band of illumination, this mural that goes round the square. Looks pretty good, I have to say. A big improvement. They also brought lights down to the ground level as well. They put the scroll type lights round the lampposts. What they do is if the lamppost has I'm trying to look for something. Here's the lamppost. It's a purple lamppost. It's a very nice lamppost. And they have a frame, and you get half a frame bolts on. It's got a little bracket comes out, and it bolts onto the lamppost, and it holds it roughly out about sort of midpoint from the lamppost. And then you get the other half of the frame, and it bolts onto the existing frame, and you end up with this round panel that surrounds the lamppost, and it's got the sort of swirls and scrolls and the fairlights in it, and it looks quite nice. They put those on almost all the lampposts, I think. Other things worthy of note, actually. The second year Field and Lawn did it, they also scrapped the ice rink, and I'm really glad they did, because it got bigger and bigger, and the corporate suite type thing they had just ended up actually intruding too much. So what they did, they replaced the ice rink with a sort of Christmas market with the stalls and the fairground rides. Big, huge improvement, much better. And also the whole square was clear for the switch-ons, which meant they could fit more people in. The ice rink was just a dog. Good riddance, ice rink. Yeah, that's in many ways. The guys at Field and Lawn were probably really glad to see the back of that too. But Lightways also added the baubles. It's a very common effect. It's a huge three-dimensional ball, but it's done as multiple sections of aluminium frames that then bolt together to create three-dimensional sculpture, and it looks like a big Christmas tree ball, the glass ball that hangs on the tree. But it's covered in the strings of the LED lights, and it's got a door in one side and a door out the other, and it's just fully three-dimensional and sort of open frame, and you can walk right through it. Quite nice. It adds a lot. People really seem to appreciate that, the interaction. Still all white, but hey, at least, you know, you can get up personally, you can touch it. That's kind of like, that's another thing I've got a slight issue with. Mains voltage being brought down to effects you can touch. But less said about that, the better. So that is more or less it. That's my involvement. So that's why the original Christmas lights lasted so long. They lasted 25 years. It's ridiculous. I did that over for 20 years. That's even more ridiculous. But a really great job. One that I really enjoyed. Made lots of friends, and it had knock-on effects because of the work with Northern Light. It kind of ended up working out not just the Christmas lights, and beyond that, ultimately it led to the knock-on effect of working the Embrid too. So yeah, happy times. I really enjoyed that job. I enjoyed working with the co-workers. It was just a really good time. Kind of sad they're gone, but in a way they'd served their time, they'd paid their way, they'd done their job. And the irony is that the lights that replaced them were based on the original design of the George Square lights, the metal frame with the rope light that they'd kind of pioneered. So interesting stuff. Definitely a great piece of Christmas lighting history I was really glad to be involved with. And that is the end of this story. So I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and if you liked it. If you then feel free to subscribe. I say that because anytime I do face videos, some people unsubscribe. It's like, oh, he's really ugly. So I just thought I'd suggest, yeah, go and subscribe it to counteract that effect. And if you want more of these, let me know actually. Do you want more of these Storytime videos? Do they go on too long? Are they a bit too rambly? What's the lighting like? Is the backdrop okay? Just let me know what you think and tell me in the comments down below.